Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called 7 Amazing Onboard UFO Encounters. This is my favorite aspect of UFO investigations. Not only is it the most interesting, I think, but really has the most potential to answer the many questions surrounding this subject, such as who are these visitors to our planet, where do they come from, why are they here? There's a lot of fear and confusion surrounding this subject. I think the only way to overcome that is to really study it, turn the unknown into the known. And that, I think, will eliminate the fear and confusion surrounding this subject. It's one of the reasons I do this research, that and because so many people are having these experiences. You can dismiss 10 cases or 100 or even 1,000, but there's tens of thousands. And there's good research indicating that it may number in the millions. That alone makes this subject of crucial importance because so many people are having this type of encounter. So the cases I've chosen for you today are not very well known. I'd be shocked if you've heard of all of them, maybe one or two. But I'm guessing you probably haven't heard of any of these. I really like finding those more obscure cases, the ones that haven't already been covered over and over again. I've got 7 cases which come from all across the world, 3 from outside of the United States, including England, Argentina, and Brazil, and 4 from within the United States, including New York, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania. These cases go way back to 1954 all the way up to 2010, so quite a wide range of time there. And I'm going to cover them chronologically. That's 7 decades. So this is really interesting to me to see how these experiences evolve over time. And really, they're very consistent. These cases do involve a wide variety of ET types. So we have short little humanoids with dark skin, light-skinned grays, human-looking ETs. There's really an amazing variety. Some of these are multiple witness cases as well. There are physiological effects and all the sort of things that we do see in these types of experiences. So let's just go to the first case, which is super fascinating and I'm guessing you haven't heard it before. This one I call, I was completely paralyzed. This occurred on November 2nd, 1954 in Santo Amaro, Brazil. And this is one of those cases that was very nearly lost to posterity and was really only coincidence that brought it out into the public eye. But I think it's an important case. This first case comes from Colonel Adil de Oliveira. He is the chief of the Brazilian Air Force's UFO research group, and he reports that this case, which he calls, quote, disturbing, was actually kept secret for some time, but during a press conference he released the details to a reporter for the Brazilian magazine called Revista de Semana, and the story was printed there along with a verbatim transcript of an interview with the witness. There's just one witness, a taxi driver by the name of Maurílio Braga Godoy. Now some sources mistakenly print his name as Marcilio, but no, it's Maurílio. It was a half hour after midnight on November 2nd, 1954, as Maurílio left the Santo Amaro streetcar terminal in Santo Amaro. This is a suburb of Sao Paulo, Brazil. You can see it here. At that hour, the streets were deserted. And I'll just quote Maurílio directly. As he says, when I arrived at Andaguara Street, I was startled to see a luminous circular object about 90 to 120 feet in diameter, or 30 to 40 meters, surrounded by a strange reddish-blue or violet glow. This light was soft and diffuse and seemed to come from the periphery of the object, which was landed on a level place. So curious about the alien craft, I decided to investigate. But as I approached it, I realized that the strange thing was greater in size and height than it looked before, and in fact, it was a very big machine. Then I stopped for a few seconds, a little frightened. The weird machine was unlike anything I had ever seen. So this craft, which he described as round, sat on an empty lot between two houses about 60 feet away from him. He really wasn't sure what to do next. In fact, his first impulse was to run away and contact authorities. But when he tried to do this, he found that he was rooted to the spot. He couldn't move. He tried to cry out, but also discovered that he couldn't make a noise. And as he says, the emotion was paralyzing, a strange feeling that persisted for some time. When the spell was broken, I decided then to make a close examination of the object, and my caution left me completely. So I continued walking towards it. Nearing the ship, I noticed an open door at one side. Not stopping to think, I came into the ship, but I cannot tell now if I stepped through a staircase or another thing. I entered into a large, circular room, illuminated by a diffuse and soft light, but I couldn't find the lamps. No one was in sight. The craft seemed to be deserted. At the center of the room there was a strangely shaped table, having behind it some kind of support, which appeared to be some type of chair. Over the table I saw some charts and maps. One of them immediately attracted my attention because it irradiated a phosphorant glow. It was, I recognized, a map of South America. I approached it to take a closer look to see if there was something written on it. I only noted the presence of marks or symbols, which appeared to be mushroom-shaped. They were scattered through the map with no understandable pattern. Now suddenly, Murillo realized that he was no longer alone in the room, and in fact 3 humanoid figures were with him. It appeared to him that they had almost walked through the walls. He had just finished studying the map when he saw them, and as he says, I raised my head and froze where I was, scared. I saw that I wasn't alone in the place anymore. 3 persons were standing in front of me. I say persons because they were like me, but they were smaller than me, less than 1.5 meters, or about 4.5 feet tall. He said they had dark brown complexions, and their hair was black, cut very short. Their clothes were a one-piece garment, like overalls, light gray in color. I saw no zippers or buttons or anything like that. The 3 men were not good-looking. So Murillo also noticed that they were wearing what looked like a belt around their waist. Each of them had a weird-looking object which was attached to the belt, which Murillo suspected might be a weapon, but he had no proof of this. The men stared at him, and Murillo had the impression that they were interested in his physical form. As he says, the expression on their faces and eyes told me clearly that I was being submitted to a careful inspection. I still couldn't move, and was so stunned that my voice had disappeared too. Then the men started to talk with each other about me in an alien language. I didn't understand the words, but I noticed a peculiar characteristic of that dialect. The letter K was repeated many times at the beginning of the words, more than any other letter. So although Murillo didn't understand the language, it was obvious to him that they were talking about him. But unfortunately his fear was so overwhelming that he was really unable to react. And as he says, it was a strange scene. I was completely paralyzed by terror. I had forgotten entirely that I could have asked some questions and made some signs about my peaceful intent. I didn't realize that time was passing, and I was getting no information by just looking at them. On the other hand, their only objective seemed to be a study of my body and nothing more. All the time, they stood motionless, just looking at me and talking to each other at the other side of the table. So while this next part is not mentioned in Murillo's first-hand testimony in the newspaper, according to researchers Jose Escobar Faria and Richard Hall, at some point Murillo was given a small cup of unknown liquid to drink. This, he said, had the effect of removing him from his, quote, hypnotic spell. He says the door to the craft closed, and the craft took off in silence. And for the next 2 hours or so, this craft, he said, flew across the South American continent and then landed back in the same location. The ETs had not spoken to him during this entire time, but once again, Murillo found himself immobilized and fearful. And when the ETs did talk, it's not clear if this was before the trip or after it, Murillo tried to talk to them, though they did not seem to understand. And as Murillo says, suddenly, I don't know how or why, I realized I was backing out, dragging my feet backwards, my eyes still fixed on the small men. They made no attempt to block my way or to seize me. I came rapidly through the door, jumped to the ground, and I started to run away as quickly as possible. When I was at a distance of about 10 meters, 30 feet, from the ship, I turned my head. Then I saw the object suspended about 10 meters, 30 feet, from the ground, having at the end some type of screw without end. Suddenly, the alien craft climbed up at high speed. At that moment, I observed again the eerie bluish-red or violet light at the periphery of the strange machine. And that's the end of the experience. Now, researcher Olavo T. Fontes did speak with the Colonel Odile de Oliveira, and asked him what he thought of the case, but the Colonel refused to comment at any length and said only that it was one of many cases in the Brazilian Air Force files, and that the final verdict on the case by the Air Force UFO experts was never released other than it was labeled as, quote, unknown. Now, Olavo Fontes was personally skeptical of the report because many of the details were identical to the contactee reports of George Adamski and Daniel Fry, which had recently received a lot of publicity, and he felt this might be more than mere coincidence. But nevertheless, he called it a, quote, good report, which he only took seriously because it came directly from an Air Force colonel. But in further support of the validity of this case, Murillo was reportedly examined by several psychiatrists in Sao Paulo who concluded that he showed no signs of neurosis or psychosis. I do find that case quite credible, not only because this case was investigated by the Brazilian military, but they took it absolutely seriously. And this case does have details that turn up again and again in modern day accounts, and it's a very early case. I understand that Olavo T. Fontes was a little bit skeptical because the details described by Murillo were very much echoing some of the details described by George Adamski and other contactees. But if you take a close look at what this witness is describing, his experience was very different from those described by contactee George Adamski and others. So I'm not sure that that's really a good reason to dismiss it, and Olavo Fontes himself said that he thought this case was worth reporting, that it was, quote, a good case. And again, we have to remember that this witness was given a psychiatric evaluation and found to be perfectly sane. So I think, yeah, it's a good case. And let's move to the next one, which I also found super interesting. This, by coincidence, also happens to involve a taxi driver. I want to thank one of my viewers, you know who you are, for alerting me about this case. So interesting. I call this one, I Was So Scared. This occurred one evening in May 1966 in the small town of Villa Maria, Argentina. And this is one of the more extensive cases I've heard in a very long time. This witness, although he was a child at the time of his encounter, describes it in incredible detail and had a lot of experiences on board this craft. And he estimates he was there for days, even though he was returned basically only 4 hours after his encounter. He had basically 4 hours elapsed when he was returned back to his location. But he feels that the events he experienced took much longer than that. That's another pattern we see with these onboard cases. But let's just get to this one because it is interesting for sure. The witness in this case, as an adult, is a taxi driver by the name of Gerardo Scharf. His childhood life was extremely difficult and was perhaps the reason for his encounter, which occurred when he was very young. As Gerardo says, when I was 7 years old, my parents kicked me out of the house and I ended up working in a field at the end of Buenos Aires Street. Now, left to fend for himself, Gerardo was taken in by a dairy farmer who employed him to work as a cowherd. Didn't really employ him, really just kind of used him as a slave. Sadly, Gerardo was badly mistreated. He was given very little food. He was forced to sleep on a mattress made of burlap sacks. He had to gather the pigs and the cows in the pre-dawn hours. He did use a horse to round them up, but he said it was a miserable life. He received no payments, he was abused horrendously, and he lived this way for 5 years. And as he says, it was, quote, ugly. I'll just quote him directly. As he says, I had a terrible time. I cried and prayed to the heavens and the stars for someone to help me, for someone to come and help me, because I was living like a dog, or maybe worse. Everything was bad for me. They punished me. They made me sleep far from the house. These people punished me badly. They made me eat alone. I slept in a little shed. He would beat me up. I was a slave. So at age 12, Gerardo's prayers to the heavens were answered, not by angels, but by apparent extraterrestrials, or perhaps celestial beings of some kind. He leaves the interpretation open. But it was about 1:30 a.m. one evening in May 1966 that all of this happened. At that time there was a heavy drizzle, and as Gerardo says, I was preparing the cattle. A white light, the likes of which I'd never seen before in my life, filled the field. The whole field lit up, and right away the cows got up and headed off on their own towards the milking area. I didn't look up because I was so scared. Gerardo told the owner of the farm about this, but he did not believe him. The same thing happened the next night, and the night after that, and then a fourth time. It was always the same. A huge bright light appeared overhead, lighting up the ground below. And in fact, on the fourth occasion, the light was very bright. Gerardo, of course, told his boss on each of these occasions, but again, he was not believed. It was about 1 week later after these incidents when it happened again, but this time it was very different. As Gerardo says, I began to hear a strange sound and an even more powerful, more intense light. It's like grabbing a flashlight and holding it really close. I heard a buzzing sound, like when you hit a beehive, and a spaceship landed in front of me. It was a flying saucer, approximately 20 meters long by 8 meters wide. That's 60 by 25 feet. And as Gerardo says, today I call them spaceships and flying saucers, but at the time I didn't know how to describe it. I was a child who grew up in poverty, who knew only the radio and had no explanation for it. So immediately Gerardo saw a door open in this craft, spilling out a bright light. A very tall being appeared in the doorway. Gerardo noticed that it had 4 fingers on each hand, and this being began to speak to him telepathically, and it said, "Come, don't be afraid." Gerardo said the voice sounded both masculine and feminine. Gerardo was riding his horse at this time and was very frightened by this strange sight, so he started to kick the horse with his heels to get her to move away, but the horse would not budge. He heard this voice calling him by name, "Gerardo, get down and come here." This did calm him down to some extent, and he found himself dismounting and approaching the craft. And this being told him again telepathically, "Come in." Now Gerardo could see a sort of illuminated ladder or staircase. It looked very unusual. He had trouble describing it. And he walked up to it to get inside this craft. And as he says, I was not abducted. I was invited. I was invited to board the ship. They invited me to go out for a walk around the universe and to meet them. Now he did describe these beings. He said that they had very pale skin, dark black eyes, tiny little nose. He said that they were, quote, tall, very thin, and all white. The head was large compared to ours. He did say he never saw them blink. And as Gerardo says, upon entering the ship, I saw 2 more beings, all seated as if they were ready to fly. They were in seats which I had never seen before and would never see again, with buttons on the armrest. When I tried to turn around to leave, there was no door. I stayed very still because I had no escape. Inside, there was a fully illuminated table. The floor was soft, white and fluffy, padded like a carpet. I can't fully describe what's inside the ship. Everything was very advanced. They were as advanced as 2 million years ahead. Everything they do in the ship is strange. It's very strange, very, very advanced. I don't know how to explain it. Everything is very nice inside. It's an inexplicable thing. So he tried to describe it but had a lot of difficulty. He said that once he was inside the ship, Objects and furniture and devices seemed to appear when they were needed and then just disappear back into the walls or the ceiling. He said pipe-like devices came out of the ceiling and retracted. He actually didn't see any walls. Instead, as he says, it was like everything was like light. I entered a place of light. He did notice there were no hard edges. He said it looked vast inside, almost infinite. Shortly after he entered, they used a device which appeared to levitate him and spin him around a little bit. This was very disorienting for him. And although he was scared, he says the beings were not in the least threatening, but in fact very friendly. And one by one, they came up and touched his head. They proceeded to show him sort of a hologram of little planets rising out from the surface of this illuminated table. He also saw what looked to him like TV monitors on a wall. He had never seen TVs at that point. But they then began to speak with him about many things, all telepathically in his mind. He did try to speak verbally at first, but this caused a bad headache, and his headache vanished as he started to communicate with them telepathically. As he says, that's how they spoke to each other, and also to me. They asked me about everything, about my life, what I was doing, why I was there, and so on. So they asked him all about his job, about how he was being mistreated. In fact, they spent quite a long time questioning him on every aspect of his life. And at this point, they took him on a trip into, apparently, space. He had the impression that they were steering the ship with the power of their minds. He said they turned a section of the craft transparent, and he could look outside, and he saw stars. He saw the Earth far below him. They showed him what he now believes was the asteroid belt, because as he says, I saw enormous rocks, about the size of a house. They took him to view the moon and the planet Saturn. He recognized the rings later on. At one point, they landed on a planet, but at that age, with no real education, he couldn't say where it was. He does remember a brief moment where it was hard for him to breathe, but this passed. He saw reddish soil beneath him, very fine. He actually picked a little bit up and let it drop, and eventually they brought him back inside the craft. Again, they would turn the side transparent. They showed him other ships, what appeared to be an alien city, which he said looked almost like glass or crystal towers, with very tall buildings. He said they were different colors, gray, green, and blue. He saw what looked like bridges between some of them. The beings didn't say anything about where this city was or who lived there. But at this point, more beings appeared, and Gerardo once again became afraid. They, of course, told him not to be afraid, and Gerardo's fear lessened when he was introduced to a much shorter being. As Gerardo says, at first you're scared because you don't know where you are. You don't know what they're going to do to you. But I calmed down when the little one appeared. They always walked with their arms straight and their heads moving. They didn't run away or act violently. As soon as I entered, they immediately controlled my mind, and I made friends in a way. I gained confidence, since I was walking around in a spaceship that had no walls. It was like another dimension. So he remembers at one point suddenly finding himself unclothed and lying on a floating table. He remembered seeing alien instruments, medical instruments of some kind that he had a lot of trouble describing. He remembered being given a physical exam. He says they did something to his arm, which left a small scar on his arm. They did show him what he believes was the engine of the craft, which again he was not really able to describe in detail, other than he did touch it and said it had a very soft texture. They showed him at one point an alcove where skeletons were being preserved, and they told him that they, meaning these ETs or celestial beings, have a normal life cycle like humans do, but live much longer. At some point, Gerardo said they also gave him food of some kind. As he says, it was, quote, through a huge tube, similar to a baby bottle, that had a strawberry flavor. Now, he's not sure how long he stayed with them, but he believes it may have been as long as 10 days. That's how it felt to him, though he does admit he was not aware of ever sleeping or going to the bathroom. At one point, he did remember seeing a symbol near some of the doorways on the craft that resembled, he said, an upside-down triangle or pyramid with an L and an upside-down U. They gave him all kinds of information. They told him that they came to Earth to take care of humanity. They also shared some prophecies of the future. They told him that Earth's technology would develop very quickly, which turned out, of course, to be true with cell phones and TVs and rocketry and all of this. They said that the Vatican contained many hidden secrets and that they were not to be trusted, that they were lying. They also warned him about another world war happening. They said that a time would come eventually when they would return and show themselves to everybody. So a lot more went on. It's a very complicated case, but finally they told him it was time to return. At this point, Gerardo cried. He begged them to let him stay and told them that he was going to be punished if he went back. But they told him he had to return. But they did say that they will be with him and will help him. And as Gerardo says, suddenly I disappeared, and I appeared sitting on the horse. I was riding on horseback towards the corral, and it was almost daylight now. So he estimates that about 4 hours passed. The owner of the farm confronted him, asked him where he had been. He had been searching for him and couldn't find him. And Gerardo told him that he had been on a ship. The owner didn't believe it and actually struck him. Soon, much of the experience did leave his mind, but the good news is his life changed for the better from that day forward. A mysterious stranger with long blonde hair and blue eyes began to visit him regularly and provide him with food. And then this man would mysteriously disappear. Gerardo tried to see where he was going, but he would just turn around and the man would be gone. The ship came back at one point, and this time the owner also saw it, and this stopped the abuse. Gerardo was never hit again. It wasn't long after that he left the farm, found another place to live. He, of course, grew up and became a taxi driver, but again had little or no memory of all of this experience. It was only at age 67, decades later, that the memories of the encounter spontaneously came back to him. He did undergo hypnotic regression to see if he could recall more details. He didn't like it. He had to go back to his very difficult childhood, which he found to be very traumatic. The onboard encounter itself was very much benevolent. To this day, he wonders about the nature and origin of these beings. He says that they called themselves, quote, celestial beings. He speculates that they might be extraterrestrials or even beings from the future. But he does feel that his experience was, although scary at times, wholly benevolent. He didn't want to leave them, but they said that he had to return to Earth. He now looks upon them as family. As he says, they were friendly. They gave me love that I needed at that age. All the love they gave me. They gave me so much love. How about that? I think we could actually label that case as a close encounter of the fifth kind, because this witness was basically calling out for help nightly, praying that someone could help him out of his situation. And he got help, perhaps not from angels, but from ETs, though he leaves open the possibility of who these beings were. He's really honestly not sure about it. But a truly amazing case. I love that he was helped so much by these ETs, that he described them as very much loving, that even following this encounter they remained in contact with him. It's also interesting to me that the details of this case left his mind, and he lived most of his life really without any memory of it, and then suddenly his memory came back spontaneously. So this case is getting a lot of recent attention. I did my best to get the details from this case accurate, because most of the reports on this case are in another language. So please excuse me if I got a little bit of it out of order perhaps, because it was difficult to put together. But I think it's a really important and certainly a very fascinating case. And now let's move to the next one. I call this one, They Were Friendly. This one occurred in July of 1974 in Fairview, New Jersey. This is a multiple witness case. There aren't a whole lot of details to it, but I like this case not only because it's a multiple witness case, but that the witness, the primary witness, was interviewed by a MUFON field investigator. I think that adds a level of credibility to it, and she certainly felt like this was a legitimate case, and it's got some details to it that I think are really important. This case comes from certified MUFON field investigator and Assistant State Director for California, Linda Fleckner. It's a rare multiple witness onboard UFO encounter involving 3 people, although Linda was only able to interview one of the witnesses, as the other 2 are now deceased. Unfortunately, the case is also somewhat sparse on details, but it still, I think, represents a profound example of an onboard encounter. I'll call the main witness Corey, that is a pseudonym. It was a Saturday morning in July of 1974, as the witnesses, 3 teenage boys, decided to go play basketball near a fire station, again in Fairview, New Jersey. They had started playing around 6 a.m. They continued for about 3 hours, and then around 9 a.m. began to walk home, and they were heading towards one of their homes, which was near a park. Now normally this park was crowded with lots of cars and anywhere from 50 to 100 people, but strangely this area appeared to be totally deserted. That was the first strange thing that happened, but the strangeness was just beginning, because at this point they looked up and saw a, quote, shining silver metallic saucer with round tinted windows. Corey was the first to see it, and as the investigator, Linda Fleckner, says, he alerted his 2 friends who also saw the craft. He heard and felt a whirring and roaring, and his shirt was flapping as if in a 50-mile-an-hour wind, but there was no wind. They were paralyzed and could not run. So suddenly, without warning, Corey found himself inside a large room, which he estimates was about 400 feet across. This was, of course, much larger than the craft had appeared from the outside. Corey was standing up, and about 30 feet away he saw his 2 friends lying on, quote, operating tables. He said there were about 25 gray-type ETs in various locations. Each was about 4 feet tall, he said, gray skin, large round heads, and large black eyes. He said 10 or 15 of the grays were kind of around him, but the others were around his 2 friends. And as Linda, the researcher, says, the creatures were touching him all over. They were speaking telepathically and were surprised when they realized that he could hear them. His impression was that they were friendly and curious and meant no harm. He believed that they were trying to help his 2 friends who both had heart problems, and he believes that their lives may have been extended by the aid rendered on the craft. He remembers looking out the window and down onto the basketball court where they had been playing. He could see other beings moving about in long corridors. And that's really all he remembers. The next thing Corey recalls is being back where they had been taken, and then watching this craft ascend up into the sky. As Linda says, it moved up and to the right, then left, then up and away, leaving behind a rainbow-colored trail behind. The next thing Corey knew, they were arriving back at his friend's house. Now, neither of his 2 friends had any memory whatsoever of being on board the ship. All they could remember was seeing the craft from the outside. They had no memory of walking home. Only Corey remembered the onboard segment. Now, upon arriving home, Corey's mother looked at him and immediately noticed that he, quote, seemed changed. Corey told his mother, "It's no big deal, Mom," but he never spoke about the incident to her or really to anyone. He did, of course, later confide his story to researcher Linda Fleckner, that his mother once told him that there was psychic ability in their family, and he wondered if perhaps that was why he was able to hear the beings speak telepathically. But yeah, he kept his encounter secret for decades, because as Linda says, he did not believe that anyone would believe him. But of course he did eventually tell his 2 daughters, and in 2023, a full 49 years after the encounter, he reported it to MUFON and shared his story with investigator Linda Fleckner. Such an amazing case, and even though I covered it in 10 minutes or so, I suspect the witness could write a whole book about what happened to him. Most people keep quiet about this. I think it's really interesting that it was his impression that his friends were being brought on board to assist with their heart issues. We do see that in a number of cases. Also interesting to me is that the witness's mother talks about psychic ability. It's another pattern we see among contactees, that they do have psychic ability. Just a lot of interesting details to that case. And here's another one that I found particularly fascinating. I'm guessing you haven't heard of it before. It's an important case though because, wow, this one's a little different. I call this one, They Only Wanted to Help Me. This occurred on February 28, 1984 in Guildford, England. And this is an interesting case for a number of reasons. One is that it appears to be a one-off. This witness was in the right place at the right time to have an encounter, or so it would appear. This very interesting case comes from UFO researcher Captain Gordon Millington. He was the chairman of SciGAP, the Surrey Investigative Group on Aerial Phenomena. This is in England, and he was also a consultant for the Flying Saucer Review. He's the author of the book Alien Encounters, and the information for this case comes from an article which appeared in the winter 1994 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. The witness is known only by his pseudonym, Tom Fraser. At the time of his encounter, he was living with his parents in Farnham, Surrey, England. He was 17 years old, and it was around 8 p.m. on February 28, 1984. This was a dark night. There were low clouds, a gentle drizzle, so no stars were visible, and Tom was driving his motorcycle near the town of Guildford, and this is when tragedy struck. As Tom says, I was involved in a road accident. A car struck me, and I was thrown off my motorbike. I was unconscious before I hit the ground, but my last clear memory was of a bright light in the sky to my right. Now, Tom assumed that he would wake up in a hospital, but to his amazement, that was not what happened. Instead, he found himself inside what appeared to be an extraterrestrial craft. As Tom says, I came to. I could see a bright light about me, and as my eyes focused, I saw three beings looking at me. The first thing I remember about them is their oversized hairless heads. They were quite pale complexioned, with a sort of off-white, light gray pigmentation. Their eyes, though quite similar to human eyes, were tilted up slightly. The pupils were diamond-shaped and at about a 45-degree angle. They were about 4 to 4.5 feet in height, and I was lying on a sort of a bed. I could see another like it to the left of me in the room, and there was a body on it, motionless and apparently unconscious. But the strange thing is that it looked remarkably like myself. I have the impression that there were only 2 of these beds in my room. There was a raised control panel in the center of the room, and someone standing at this could look at both the beds. The beings were standing behind this control console, and one appeared to be operating it, with the 2 others standing behind him. I have the impression of a leader and helpers situation in this room. So it looked to Tom like the man on the other bed that looked like himself was actually deceased. At this point, the beings began to communicate telepathically with Tom. As Tom says, I could hear words saying that they were going to heal me and that I should not worry, but their mouths were not moving. I now believe that these beings were communicating telepathically. I could sense no malice or hostility from them and felt that they only wanted to help me. I laid my head back and fell asleep. So an undetermined amount of time later, Tom reawakened, and as he says, when I awoke, I was told that my injuries had been extensive, but that they had been able to cure them. They also said I was lucky that they had been observing the area and that they were able to help me. I was told I would feel tired for a while and that I should rest. Then I fell asleep again. When I reawakened, I saw that the other body had been removed, and I saw no other humans aboard the craft. I found myself dressed in some clothing similar to that of the beings themselves. It had a metallic sheen to it, and was grayish in color, but there were no buttons or zippers. Perhaps it had some sort of Velcro seams. So Tom also remembers getting a good look at the interior of the craft and describes it in similar ways to what other contactees report. As Tom says, the corridors had no form of lighting such as we would use, for the walls and the ceiling emitted light and there were no shadows. I also have an impression of another room with a control bridge, with 1 or 2 entrances. One being was working at a raised panel, while 2 others operated some controls. There was a display panel on one wall. I also have vague memories of what I think was some sort of maintenance or docking bay, a large area with 2 or 3 craft in it. So Tom does feel that his encounter was totally benevolent and that the purpose for his encounter was all about healing. As he says, "At no time do my memories indicate any hostile act, maltreatment, or any intention of acting harmfully towards me. One very strong impression I retain is of the leader asking for my help in something. I agreed to help, but I do not now know what I agreed to. One of them said that they would have to break my arm, as it would look too strange if I walked away with no injuries after being hit head-on by a car and thrown off my motorbike into some trees. I agreed to all of this." So following the accident, Tom was taken directly to Epsom Hospital, just a few miles away from the accident site. His injuries included a severe fracture of the upper third of the right humerus and some nerve damage. Later, he did get a severe infection, which resulted in the loss of most of his right elbow, he said. But it was about 5 or 6 hours after the crash that he regained full consciousness in his hospital room. And he is now convinced that the ETs not only healed him, but that they saved his life. As Tom says, "The staff were puzzled that I had only a broken arm, as my motorbike was very severely damaged. I believe I should have died in that accident, but for some unknown reason I did not." How amazing is that? I know of a number of cases where people were rescued by ETs, certainly healed. That's not at all unusual. But to actually have your life saved is definitely unusual. But I will say I've got a number of cases of that as well. It's also an interesting case because he remembers it fully consciously. In fact, we see that in all of these cases. These people recalled their events without the aid of hypnosis. Although one of them did use hypnosis to recall some details, he already remembered quite a bit of it. I think that's an important point, an important distinction, because it really lays to rest all skeptics' arguments that this is all false memory syndrome brought out by regressive hypnosis. That's simply not true. And this case is so amazing to me because this witness, again, appeared to be in the right place at the right time, and he was very lucky to be pulled on board and have his life saved. So interesting. Now let's move to the next case. I call this one, "We're Just Curious." This one occurred on October 13, 1994 in Buffalo, New York. This case is in many ways your sort of typical onboard experience where the witness is physically examined, but she describes it so sincerely and so clearly that I think it's an important case that definitely adds to our knowledge of what it's like to have an onboard UFO encounter. This case is somewhat brief, and it was reported to the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, by the witness about 30 years after it occurred. But it's still an interesting case with some important details, and it really shows how profoundly an onboard experience can affect a person physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The witness is anonymous. I'll call her Natalie. This is, of course, a pseudonym. At the time of her encounter, Natalie was a freshman in college, and she was living in a dorm room in Buffalo, New York. This was on October 13, 1994. And as Natalie says in her own words, "I was asleep when I started to feel a pulling, a strong suction on my body. As it was pulling me, I did not feel as if I could resist or move. I was almost frozen, but without pain, just the pressure of the suction. And then I had the sense that I was being pulled out of the room, out of my dorm room window. Then I woke up in a different place. When I came to, or woke up again, I was on a metal table surrounded by beings, but not human beings. I was on some sort of examining table, and they were all around me. I don't know how many, but approximately 6 or 7. They were smaller than humans, with bigger eyes, black eyes, and dark gray bodies, almost the color of shark skin. The most vivid memories from this experience involved being on that table, feeling the metal, and feeling that I could not leave or move. I was terrified, and my communications with them. Because the message or communication was very clear and warm and friendly, but they did not use English words. They talked to me without words, almost as if they placed the information in my brain with their minds. And what they said was, "Don't be scared. We won't hurt you. We're just curious." And then my body felt calm, but it seemed like it came from them, as if they did something to calm me. I don't know how to explain it. And then I lost time again, and I woke up in my dorm room in my bed. Now these beings do appear to be the typical Greys, and at first Natalie told nobody what happened, but it was less than a week after the encounter that she did discover a strange mark on her body, and this encouraged her to seek another opinion. As Natalie says, "I noticed a weird mark on my top right butt cheek. It looked like, and still looks like this today, like someone took a scoop of skin out of my body. The weirdest part is that it didn't hurt, and it didn't bleed or bruise. It was just there all of a sudden." I told my mom about it, and she's actually the first person who suggested it was an abduction. The weirdest part is that I had not even told her about the other part of the story, where I was sucked out of the room and placed on that metal table. Before I told her any of that, she told me that she had read a book about UFOs, and there were people that had tissue taken, that the marks that were left on their bodies looked like the mark on my body. So ultimately, Natalie does feel that this experience was positive, but nevertheless it is something that she keeps secret from almost everyone. As she says, "I've never formally reported this to anyone. I've only shared it with very close friends, my mother, and a doctor due to the unexplained skin and tissue removal. I think about this experience from time to time, but always with fondness, because they, the extraterrestrials, seemed like kind beings and tried to calm me. I don't talk about it very often, because the few times that I have talked about it with people that are not close, trusted friends, like once in art school, was not a great experience, and people remarked that I was making it up or doing it for attention. But the truth is that it's a lonely thing to experience something so unreal, something you cannot explain, and not have anyone to talk to about it. It's just case after case. Again, you could dismiss one, but there's always another to take its place. It's really interesting to me that this witness feels that this experience was, although scary, absolutely benevolent. And really the hardest part about dealing with it has been trying to share the experience with other people who are skeptical. That's such a shame. There's still a hostile climate surrounding this subject. Witnesses who come forward find themselves not only being disbelieved, but ridiculed or gaslit. That is really a darn shame, because I think our own governments know that this is a real subject, and very disingenuously they're putting forth the idea that all of these experiences can be explained away as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness, all the while knowing fully that it's a completely real subject. I think all of us have become victims of the UFO cover-up, and it's time that it ends, because this is a subject that's very important and should absolutely be taken seriously, if only because so many people are having experiences like this. And here's another one, which I call, "I was extremely scared." This one occurred on June 16, 2002 in Blanchard, Oklahoma. It's relatively recent. Some of you say, "Oh, where are all the recent cases?" Oh, they're there. And you can see that I report them in many of my episodes. This is a case that does involve multiple witnesses. And you can see that the title of this one is absolutely accurate, because the witnesses did have quite a bit of fear with their encounter, and it affected them profoundly for a very long time, and probably still to this day. This case does involve two witnesses, but only one has stepped forward. The witness is anonymous. I'll just call him Ethan. Again, that's a pseudonym. His experiences have not been officially investigated, but he does provide his first-hand testimony. He was 9 years old at the time of his encounter, and he was having a family get-together at his grandmother's house located just off Highway 78 in the countryside outside of Blanchard, Oklahoma. Her house had a long driveway, was a large piece of property with lots of trees, almost no houses around, and had many of wide open areas and a pond. So after eating and talking and playing, Ethan and his cousin announced that they were going to take a walk to the pond. At this point, it was 9:45 p.m. on June 16, 2002. So they left the house and walked about 100 feet from the house, and this is when things began to get weird. As Ethan says, we both started to feel vibration in our body, but didn't think too much of it. We walked maybe 15 more feet, and we were completely blind. We both saw nothing but black. We backed up and we could see normally again. It was dark outside, but not pitch black. You could still see some. We looked at each other and said, "That's weird," and blew it off. We kept walking 5 to 10 more feet, and it goes pitch black. Now at this point, they can't see, but they both heard a swooshing noise, as if something was moving at super fast speeds. Their vision immediately returned, and they could now see a, quote, huge disc-shaped craft. And as Ethan, the witness, says, it was black with a chrome-like finish. And I want to say windows around it, with every color you could think of coming from inside the craft. It was moving north-northeast to the right of us. We were walking east. It hovered approximately 15 feet away at tree height for 30 seconds, and then descended to an open area of trees and landed. At this point, we were extremely terrified. We couldn't move. We felt locked in place and having our thoughts scanned. A door opened up, popping out from the top and periodically turning inside itself until it touched the ground. Now at this point, some strange beings emerged from the craft. As Ethan says, 3 beings with big heads and huge eyes stepped out and walked up to me. They looked like what most people call grays. The next thing I know, I'm inside the craft on a table with the 3 beings looking at me. There was a human-looking being standing to my right side. I'm not sure if it was human or not. Ethan was also able to get a good look at the room he was in. There wasn't much to it. As he says, the walls looked metallic, but also looked like if you touched them, you would fall through. There wasn't much in the room besides, I want to say, a bathtub-looking thing with black goo-looking stuff inside it. Now the next thing Ethan knew, he was being physically examined. As he says, while I'm lying on the table, the grays stared at me, getting inches from my face. I blacked out, and the next thing I know, I'm looking up at the sky at it, hovering tree height. It was like I went back in time or something. I was extremely scared. Me and my cousin ran frantically back to the back door, running into the house. This took what we thought was 1 minute or 1 minute and a half. As we ran in, our family were worried, asking us where we have been, saying that they were looking for us for an hour and a half. So that was shocking because it did not seem that long to them. But it was then that Ethan and his cousin noticed some alarming physiological effects. As Ethan says, I had scars on me, and I was bleeding down my arm and my head. My cousin had bruises and was bleeding on his knee. We never told them what we had encountered. Now Ethan does say that this encounter was the first of several, the most recent being on July 26, 2015, which he said was a very moving encounter, but he does not provide any details. He says he reported this childhood encounter because, as he says, I need some support or help. Like many people who have these experiences, it has taken somewhat of an emotional toll on him. As he says, this is really making me feel out of place here on Earth. I would like to tell my other encounters, but I need reassurance that this isn't going to cause me to lose my life. My heart goes out to this witness. You can see he's still having a very hard time dealing with this, but I think it's an important case. He describes what it's like inside a craft. And it's interesting to me because often people will see rooms that are very much sparse. There's not a whole lot in there. And this is exactly what he's reporting. We're feeling like the walls are different. It's just so fascinating to me how these details turn up again and again from cases that are widely separated in time and geographically. All these incredible commonalities and similarities, I think, argue for the credibility of these cases. These are details that you couldn't just make up, and people are describing them over and over again. So now let's move to the final case in this compilation. I call this one, It Got Extremely Bizarre. This one occurred one evening in mid-October of 2010 in Harleysville, Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of fascinating aspects to this encounter. For me, one of the most interesting was how this witness described what we call the Oz effect, an eerie silence surrounding a witness when they suddenly have an experience like this. And he described it in incredible detail, I think really illustrating what it's like right prior to being taken on board, but also described the interior of this craft and all the things that happened to him. It's a fascinating case. This case is also a single witness case. The witness is anonymous. I'll call him Frank. That's a pseudonym. At the time of his encounter, Frank was 19 years old, almost 20, and he lived in a house located in Harleysville, Pennsylvania. The house used to be an old office building, and Frank's bedroom had a fire escape exit, complete with a metal platform, railing, and metal stairs leading down to the ground. And Frank would often use the fire escape when he wanted to smoke a cigarette, as his landlord forbade any smoking in the house. Now, the door to this fire escape had an old-fashioned push bar with no doorknob on the outside, so if he went out there, he had to prop the door open or he would be locked outside. This is an important detail given what happened next. With one evening in mid-October 2010, he stayed up late playing video games and around 1 a.m. went to sleep dressed only in his boxers. He was tired and fell asleep quickly, and the next thing he knew, Frank woke up suddenly to find himself standing outside his bedroom on this metal railing of the fire escape. He was very groggy, somewhat confused, and he started looking around to orient himself because he had no memory of how he had gotten outside. And furthermore, the door leading back into his bedroom was now closed, leaving him locked outside. He considered the possibility that he had been sleepwalking, like he used to when he was a young kid, but that hadn't happened since he was 8 years old, and now he was totally awake. And as Frank says, I almost immediately noticed something very, very large above me after this initial confusion. I felt the urge to look up at this large object hovering above me. I noticed it was sort of rounded in shape, but had many, many lights on the underside of it. It was directly above me, so I had no view of the sides of the object. The lights were a very, very bright white, nothing like any fluorescent bulb I have ever seen. These lights were flashing without any pattern, it seemed, and were located all over the underside of the object in rectangular and trapezoidal shapes. Now, this object, he estimates, was at least 250 feet in diameter, possibly larger. The bottom had what looked like weird protrusions, but they were very hard to make out or identify as the lights were so blindingly bright that he had to actually shield his eyes. The surface looked like a very dark gray-black color. Another thing he noticed was that the object made absolutely no sound. But it was more than that. The area around him was also eerily silent. And as Frank says, it was as if it, the object, was making everything around it completely quiet. There were no sounds made after I noticed the object above me. This was extremely strange, since my home is on a main road and relatively close to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Hearing not even the sound of a cricket chirp or the hum of the highway was definitely weird. The silence was almost suffocating. It felt very heavy, as if it were making the air thick, like soup. There was no wind. It was as if time had stopped in its tracks. So Frank estimates that this craft was hovering maybe 20 to 40 feet overhead, and was so large that it stretched out over the tree next to his house and out over the neighbor's roof, so that he could really only see a portion of it. And as Frank says, I observed all of this within less than 90 seconds before I became very disoriented. I forgot what I was doing, where I was, and who I was. It was almost as if these lights were inducing an acute case of amnesia. The last thing I can remember before passing out was the strange sensation of floating. I had never experienced this before, but it was as if I were suddenly weightless. My feet were no longer touching the cold metal platform, and I was no longer shielding my eyes. As soon as I was blinded by the flashing lights, I seemed to lose consciousness, unless the lights caused me to forget everything, leaving me with no memory of anything afterwards. Now the next thing Frank knew, he was waking up someplace else. As he says, after I lost consciousness, it got extremely bizarre. I remember waking up without any senses except for my sight and sense of balance. I was lying down with my eyes looking upwards towards what seemed to be a ceiling. My eyes were not working correctly, though. It was as if I had been administered eye drops that you would get at the doctor's to dilate your pupils. Everything was very blurry and distorted. I remember very little, but I do remember everything was a green, brown, gray color around me. I also remember seeing strange objects above me that appeared to be tools or examination equipment, none of which seemed to be created by humans. It was very blurry though, so it was hard to tell if that was exactly what it was. I then remember a figure moved into view above me. I was unable to move at all. My vision was very poor, so I could discern nothing about this being other than it seemed a little taller than I am, and it had appendages, like a human being, arms, torso, head, legs, etc. Now it was at this point that the being began to communicate with Frank telepathically. As Frank says, it did not speak to me. However, I seemed to hear a voice in my head. It was much less a voice than it was a feeling or emotion being conveyed. The very last thing I can remember was feeling very calm, as if this being was trying to help me in some sort of way. The trying to help you feeling was much less about me in particular, but more of a you, as in your race. I then saw one of the objects above me move slightly, and I lost consciousness again. The next thing Frank knew, he was back in his bedroom. As he says, when I came to, I was sitting on the edge of my bed. My bed was made very neatly, as if I had never laid down at all that night. When I looked at my alarm clock, the time was about 4:45 a.m. I tried to remember how I got there, but nothing came to mind. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts were buzzing faster than I could even keep up with. I could not sleep that night, no matter how hard I tried. The only thing I kept asking myself was, why wasn't I scared or afraid throughout this entire experience? So this encounter left Frank with more questions than answers, but to this day he still thinks about it. As Frank says, I always thought the UFO phenomenon was a bunch of crap before this experience. Since this experience, I have been haunted and have wanted to tell somebody, but I have always been too afraid of being called a crackpot. The only person I ever told this story to is my best friend, and he is probably the only person who will ever know who I am and what I witnessed. I am not trying to garner attention in any way, shape, or form. This is why I am choosing to remain anonymous. I just hope that maybe this can help somebody understand things a little better, even if I cannot understand any of this myself. There you go, another onboard encounter. It's funny to me that skeptics will say, oh, people are just trying to get attention. No, they're not. They don't want attention. And they almost always request anonymity, particularly when it's an on-board UFO encounter. These are people who are just searching for answers. People who had an experience that they know is important and feel that people deserve to know the truth about it. They're not asking for money or fame. Exactly the opposite. So any arguments that people are just seeking attention is ridiculous. They're not. So there you go. 7 cases of people who've been taken on board a craft coming from all over the world, all different kinds of people, different types of ETs, and yet the commonalities with all of these experiences, I think, argue for their credibility. And as we see, each case has their own unique elements, little details that perhaps have never been heard before or are only rarely reported. This is why each case is important. Each adds to our knowledge of who these visitors are, where they come from, why they're here, and most importantly, turn, like I said in the beginning, the unknown into the known. I think it's the fear of the unknown that is largely the cause of all the confusion and fear surrounding this subject. Once we know what to expect, it's not as scary. At least I hope so. At any rate, I think that these onboard cases show pretty clearly that they're not here to hurt, harm, scare, or take over or anything like that. While it can be very scary, as we've seen in this compilation here, some of these people are apparently being healed. So I think that argues for the benevolence of the ETs. And remember, they've been around here since recorded history, and very likely a lot longer than that. I think that's an important detail. So I just don't buy our government's fear-based narrative that they're coming here to take over or hurt anybody or anything like that. I do know people who have had what they feel is an absolutely negative encounter. And it's their encounter, so they absolutely have the right to interpret it the way they want to. But having interviewed hundreds of people and having examined case after case after case, I'm very encouraged about ET contact, and I think it's good news for humanity. But again, I'm just reporting the cases in a factual, unbiased way. I'm trying to choose cases that I think are lesser known, cases that are well vetted, cases that have something to add to our knowledge of what's going on here. And again, you can make up your own mind about it. But I do thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. Again, this is a very important subject, and I think it deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. So thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I'll see you next week. Bye for now.